Okay, I guess we're recording. James Steele, thank you very much for coming on my podcast.
No problem. Pleasure to be here, Todd.
All right, so you're a sports scientist. How long have you been doing that, and what got you into it? And was it an interest in science? Was it an interest in sports? Tell us how you came to study this so much.
Wow. Okay. So my going back to kind of like what was the driving interest for me is, and I'm not embarrassed of it at all, but it's an incredibly like nerdy, geeky origin story. Um, I was always an athlete growing up. I ran track. I played basketball. Was generally, pretty good at most sports. But the thing that really kind of got me into I always played sports, but what really kind of drove me into training per se was honestly watching, like, being in that era that grew up watching Dragon Ball Z.
Watching what?
And Dragon Ball Z.
I don't know what that
And
is.
it's it's a 2000s anime. Well, it's not. It's from earlier than that. But when anime series first started kind of like drifting over to the West, and weren't quite as popular as they are now. I know, like, way back when Akira kind of was the movie that most people were familiar with in the West in terms of Japanese animation. And I was maybe 13, 14, and Dragon Ball Z was on Cartoon Network, and I remember watching it and just being. I was always. I grew up being a fan of Japan anyway. I'm learning Japanese as a language and been fascinated by the culture. And then all of a sudden, it was like there was a show that was incredible, and I found out, oh my god, it's from Japan as well. But anyway, it was, it's a typical kind of shonen. The characters train, that it's martial arts, and they get stronger. And I became kind of somewhat obsessed with that idea, which got me into resistance training. And yeah, so it was a mixture of sort of sports and conditioning, and then and anime influence. And then
I didn't know that anime pushed people into sports science. I didn't know there was a
no.
connection.
Well, so I wasn't sure what to do, because when I went to college, which I guess would be the equivalent of kind of high school, we call it college over here. I studied business, maths, IT, accounting, and I thought I was going to be, working in the financial industry in some way, shape, or form. But I hated it. I didn't stimulate me at all. I worked for a year at a building society, where I did meet my wife, so that was a good outcome from that. But yeah, I didn't enjoy that, and we both kind of sat down and decided I should pursue something that I was interested in. So Solent University. I live in Southampton. I've lived in Southampton my whole life. They were just starting in 2007 their first sport and exercise science degree, and so it was the right sort of. It was perfect timing, really. So I started the undergraduate degree, graduated from that in 2010. And then got a taste of research doing that, working with my supervisor, Dr. Stuart Bruce Lowe. And then because I realized how much I enjoyed research, I was encouraged early on to consider a PhD. And so kind of went straight from undergrad into a PhD program, and finished that in 2014. And along that, started teaching and getting involved in a lot of other projects. And it's all kind of snowballed since then.
So before you got into doing formal sports science, were you doing like informal bro science on your own in terms of like doing personal training? Was that kind of the gateway?
I mean, so I was training myself, but yeah, the primary source of information was probably Flex magazine. And it was funny, actually, because
Were you doing bodybuilding, or was this more trying to be a better sprinter or an athlete?
I was interested in bodybuilding until the realization that I just did not have the genetics for it. I had to come to terms with that fairly early on. But yeah, I was interested in the role that kind of training could have in terms of sports performance, just general kind of health and well-being. I was generally just interested in it, and I'm a little bit of a masochist as well. And so kind of got the taste for I'm one of those rare people who like training and like training very hard. But it was funny actually, like speaking of Flex magazine, and kind of what led me onto my PhD research was it was a strange coincidence, because in 2007 was when Arthur Jones passed away, and
Arthur Jones, the guy who started high intensity training, hit.
yeah. So he started out, he's a fascinating character, if you ever get the chance to kind of dig
Chain
into his history.
smoked.
Yeah, his he was a multimillionaire across a variety of industries. He's got, something like hundreds of patents against his name for ranging from exercise equipment to camera equipment and filming. His ranch in Ocala, Florida, was eventually became John Travolta's home. He had runways, he had a private zoo, and his I'm going to forget exactly what it's called, but his autobiography is something called like faster planes, bigger crocodiles, and something women. So you can get an idea of what he was like from that. But yeah, he died in 2007, the year I started my degree, and I remember reading a copy of Flex magazine that had a kind of obituary in there for him, and talked about him starting the Nautilus exercise company, and the sort of development of, really it was his Nautilus company and Nautilus machines that kind of sparked off the resistance machine kind of boon in the leisure and sort of fitness sector. Pretty much every gym you look in, like, resistance machines are all derivatives nowadays of those early Nautilus designs, and albeit unknowingly to him, a lot of his machines were already sort of in existence from Gustav Zander's old equipment from the late 1800s, early 1900s. Although Jones kind of apparently found out about them after he had made a lot of his designs. But yeah, anyway, it was a weird coincidence, because I started my undergrad degree, and Stuart Bruce Lowe was already involved in some research using the Medex lumbar extension machine, which is Medex was a subsequent company that Arthur Jones founded after he sold Nautilus, which also made exercise machines. But he kind of changed his interest more towards wanting to produce things that could have more clinical applications. I remember sitting in this session because Stuart was looking for undergrad students who were interested in getting involved and learning a bit about research, and he was going to be running an RCT, and wanted to know if people wanted to get involved and gain some experience. And so I was interested in that, and I went along to this seminar where he introduced the study and talked a bit about the background, and this name Arthur Jones kept coming up, and Medex, and I was like, I feel like I've heard that before. And I remember kind of reaching down into my bag and finding this copy of Flex magazine and looking. I was like, oh my god, like this is the guy that died recently. And then I got involved in the study that he was running, helped out with a lot of the data collection, spent a lot of time working with the lumbar extension machine, and reading a lot of the sort of literature in that area. And then the opportunity came to move into a PhD program, and I decided that I'd pursue research in that area. So looking at the application of kind of isolated lumbar extension resistance training, specifically in chronic low back pain. I should say my undergraduate dissertation used the device as well, but I shot myself in the foot of trying to do an overly complicated intervention study as an undergrad when I had very little time to do it, and so subsequently didn't do a very good study.
Uh-huh. So you've done a lot of research on low back pain, chronic low back pain, and its relationship to low back extensor strength, low back extensor endurance, whether you can treat low back pain by working on low back strength and endurance, especially through the use of this special Medex machine. I've seen lots of studies you can do. Let's kind of go through this research, because I know you've done a lot of work in this area. What have you found about correlations between low back pain and low back extensor strength?
Yeah, so I guess probably to start off with, one of the first things I did during my PhD, which most people do, is to do literature reviews. And so the general kind of premise around the research that I was doing was to say, well, first of all, is there even really a problem that could potentially be addressed by specifically strengthening that musculature? And so I did a literature review, which was subsequently published, that was essentially a kind of reappraisal of the deconditioning hypothesis in low back pain, because reading over a lot of that literature, deconditioning was always kind of it was very poorly defined, in my opinion. It was kind of this kind of general sort of phenomenon that people and bear in mind, this is probably 10 years ago now. So people's operational definitions of things and the nuance that they apply to these discussions, it has definitely moved on, I think. But a lot of the early literature around this topic conflated things like general fitness and reduced, general fitness or elements of physical capacity. And they lumped them in the same sort of category as reductions in behavioral outcomes. So like if someone was less physically active, that was kind of, almost taken as like, oh, they're deconditioned. And the sort of direction of relationships was a little bit confused, and it wasn't really easy to tease out exactly what was going on there. So I kind of said, well, I'm interested in specifically looking at whether or not it's worthwhile applying something specifically to the lumbar extensors. Other things could be deconditioned, but let's start off with saying, like, are the lumbar extensor musculature generally deconditioned in chronic low back pain? And so I did a literature review, which kind of broke it down into 3 areas, which was to look at functional outcomes, strength, force production capacity of that musculature, which requires the exclusion of hip extensor torque to be able to measure well. I've got a little bit more relaxed on that, I think, a little bit now. I think some of the early stuff, and I was sort of like I bought in way more strongly than I probably do now on most things, to the how important the isolation is there.
Well, let's talk about the original idea there. So how do you test whether someone has strong low back extensors? Now, you could have them do that thing where you grab onto a table and you put the legs behind you, and how long can you hyperextend the legs behind you, or pick up a heavy weight and that tests the low back musculature. Or you can get rid of the hip extensors and just test the low back on one of these machines. So what are the differences between these approaches, and why does it matter?
Yeah, so I mean, in the first 2 examples you gave, is what we would refer to as trunk extension, as being a compound movement. So there is in those kinds of movements, admittedly, you gave some isometric examples, but I'm going to use movement in a kind of quite general sort of sense there. The resistance that is what is being resisted is acting across multiple joints there. And again, as I say that, obviously even isolated lumbar extension is occurring across multiple joints in the spine. But if we can broadly categorize it, those movements involve a hip extension moment and also a lumbar extension moment as well. And so, you have the large musculature of the glutes and the hamstrings that are contributing primarily to hip extension. And then you've got the various muscles of the lumbar extensor group that contribute more to the lumbar extension component of those movements. And there's a lot of kind of converging evidence from various different areas that at least suggests that, someone who has strong trunk extension, someone who is strong in trunk extension may not necessarily have strong lumbar extension when you remove the hip extension component and test them in isolation. And actually, to give an interesting example, we published a study. We published it a couple of years ago, but it's only just gone to print because journal of strength and conditioning research take forever to send their issues out. But actually, one of my existing current PhD students was involved with a project with me a few years back. He's a powerlifter, and we actually managed to recruit a number of competitive powerlifters, some of which were incredibly strong. and we tested them on the lumbar extension machine. We had competitive and non-competitive powerlifters, and we also had, from a previous study that James Fisher had completed, a comparator group of just generally kind of healthy, resistance-trained males. And what we see is there was essentially very little difference between those three groups. So despite the fact that the powerlifters
How can
were...
it be that powerlifters don't have strong low back muscles?
I know. I was almost expecting, like, I was expecting us to be proven wrong here. Like, I was really expecting them to be stronger than they were. And
I mean, let's make sure everyone understands this. You take a bunch of guys who are doing heavy deadlifts, heavy squats. These are movements where you really feel it in the low back, and you look at the low back muscles on these guys, and they're huge. But you tested them on this Ilex low back isolation machine, and they're not doing that much better on this than other people. How do you explain that?
Well, so this is where I think, you know, the movements that they're doing are probably not providing as much stimulation to that muscle group and you know, developing strength in that musculature as, you know, we would expect. There's obviously going to be a skill component to it as well, although because we test in, you know, isometrically, it's minimal skill, although there is always going to be a skill component to it anyway. But yeah, I mean, like not, you know, not to give an anecdotal example, but we had a guy in there who was, you know, easily had 100 pounds on me, and in terms of body weight, and was probably deadlifting, you know, nearly sort of 3 times what I can lift. And yet his lumbar extension strength.
And you crushed him on the machine?
Yeah.
I mean, that makes me think that there's specific skills involved in using that machine. But on the other hand, I've used machines like that, and the whole point of them is to take away the whole motor learning aspect of it, because the machine stabilizes everything for you. All that's left to do is push.
Exactly. Like I almost want there to be a more simple explanation, because it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't feel like it should be as simple as saying like, yeah, their lumbar extensors are not particularly well conditioned. But you know, there's going back as well to the idea of whether this is something that's present in low back pain. We reviewed the literature, and there are a number of issues with the studies when we did this review that looked at. We did look at studies that compared trunk extension between symptomatic and asymptomatic individuals. And the results across them are way more variable. Like some show no difference, some contrasting, they actually show people with low back pain have slightly better, you know, trunk extension endurance or strength or whatever.
So trunk extension could be created by the powerful hip extensors. That's so it's not isolating the way you'd be
exactly. Yeah. But when you look across the studies that have tested isolated lumbar extension, there tends to be there's more consistently evidence that those with low back pain tend to have lower than typical lumbar extension.
Okay, so you maybe you get the correlation between back pain and the low back strength, but hasn't maybe it's McGill who's found that there is a correlation between low back extensor endurance as tested through trunk extension and the kind of line on the table test? What's the research on that?
Yeah, so I mean, we have some data where we have taken trunk extension endurance using the Bering-Sorensen test, and also lumbar extension strength in both healthy and symptomatic low back pain participants. And it's interesting because I think, like I said, you know, when you look across the body of literature that's measured trunk extension, there's far more sort of variability in terms of the findings. There's, to be honest, I'd like to go back at some point and properly meta-analyze all this, because back then during my PhD, I didn't have the requisite statistical skills to be able to do that kind of analysis. Whereas now I'm involved in a lot of meta-analyses as the person doing that analysis now, and so it's on my list to go back and do properly. But at the time, I was kind of just interpreting, you know, what does the trend of results look like? And you know, like for example, some of McGill's studies and a number of others have shown that trunk extension endurance might be more predictive, but trunk extension strength is not. Very few studies have measured, for example, trunk strength and endurance and lumbar extension and strength and endurance. But when we've looked at both healthy and symptomatic participants, there's a very poor correlation between performance in a trunk extension endurance test and lumbar extension strength. So they seem to be definitely kind of measuring different things. So yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of messy. One of the issues I had with the literature on lumbar extension strength at that point in time was most of the studies were pretty old, and very few, in fact, not I don't think any of them, if I'm remembering correctly, had explicitly excluded those with previous those with chronic low back pain who had had previous surgery, or had well, surgery was the main issue, because obviously prior posterior surgery is going to have a big impact on the musculature, and so although it was maybe unlikely that many of the participants had previous surgery, we were interested in knowing whether or not there was a difference in symptomatic and asymptomatic individuals when we controlled for that. So we did do a study, a couple of my students led on a few years back. Becky Conway and Jesper Henner were the kind of leads on that research, and we recruited a relatively large sample size compared to the previous research as well. We had nearly 100 participants for that study, and both healthy and symptomatic. And we did find that when you exclude for surgery, there was still a lower lumbar extension strength in those with chronic low back pain. Now, the difficult thing is here is this is all cross-sectional. This is all associative.
Yeah, let's get into the perspective and the causal analysis, because I know you've done that as well.
So we've not explicitly collected data on that ourselves, but yeah, one of the things I did in that review, to go back to it as well, was we looked at obviously functional outcomes. So we looked at strength, isolated lumbar extension strength. We also looked at studies of morphological and histological characteristics of the musculature itself. So, was there reduced cross-sectional area, reduced density, both at the whole muscle and fiber level. And then we also looked at fatigability characteristics using from studies that had used like spectral analysis of or power analysis of EMG signals. And again, there seems to be, when you take the body of literature cross-sectionally, there seems to be at least some consistency in terms of those with back pain seem to have evidence in general of some degree of specific deconditioning. The prospective studies are a little bit more difficult because there are fewer of them. I mean, prospective studies are harder to do. They typically had, there was only really one study that had used lumbar extension strength. Most had looked at trunk extension. And so we had to be a little bit more sort of cautious in our interpretation of those prospective studies. But again, there was some evidence that, those who were weaker were at higher risk of sustaining an injury that might lead to chronicity at some point in the future.
Is that your proposed causal connection between poor low back strength and pain is an acute injury?
I think so. I think logically it makes sense.
Or is it a chronic buildup of minor injuries over time, or both?
I personally, I think it could be both, because I mean, logically, you can't have chronic pain unless you've had acute pain. so something has.
Sometimes you get pain that comes on without any. Oh my God, that hurts.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's probably some sort of, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but some sort of thresholdish kind of model where there are. I like Vert Mooney's analogy. His autobiography is great, by the way. I definitely recommend it. Called The Unguarded Moment, and he uses the metaphor to kind of describe the various kind of so things that have happened throughout his life that really influenced him, but also uses it to describe the idea that injury and pain occurs in those moments we experience where we're not able to kind of guard against them, and that could happen because demands exceed capacity at a particular point in time, or for whatever reason we're not able to muster the capacity to be able to resist whatever demands are placed on us, and that could be a something acute as there's some lapse in motor controls. We go to bend over and pick up a pen, or lifting 800 pounds in a deadlift, or or the slow accumulation of wear and tear over time that could potentially. And this is, I'm always really cautious about this because I think this is very much a probabilistic model, in that these things probably are moderating the effect, in that they increase the probability that you will be susceptible to stuff like
It's
this.
one
Maybe.
factor of many in low back pain. We're talking about this one factor because we're interested in it. We're focusing on it. But
Exactly, yeah.
I know from reading your stuff, and from reading my stuff, back pain is complex, multifactorial. You won't find super high correlations between any specific pathological defect in the back, at least that we know of, and low back pain. But maybe this is one of the factors that is controllable, and that we can. Well, let's talk about that treatment. You have some research as well on treating low back pain with doing the work on the MedX low back machine. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so that kind of led into the first part of my PhD was like, establish, is there a problem that's worth trying to address with this? And then the second step was, okay, well, if we do think that there is at least some evidence that specific lumbar extensor deconditioning could be a, not the a component in low back pain, what can we do about that? So the obvious thing is, well, a resistance training intervention can help address muscular deconditioning. And so we had, I did a review as well to look at, well, what is the evidence on the best, sort of approaches to specifically addressing lumbar extensor deconditioning, and a number of studies have shown that if you train trunk extension, you typically don't develop isolated lumbar extension as much as if you train specifically. That could be a specificity component, but I think there's converging lines of evidence.
Why is that, by the way? Because when I do these exercises that you're calling just trunk extension, I feel my lower back really working. If I'm picking up, if I'm doing a deadlift, if I'm doing the leg hyperextension thing, I feel my low back working, and it feels like the weak link. Is it because you can kind of cheat a little bit and maybe not keep the lordosis, or what's going on there?
Yeah, do you know what? Like, I have a kind of speculation as to what that might be, and I wonder if to some extent that what is being experienced is a perception of the tension across the thoracolumbar fascia primarily. And I wonder whether or not it's less about because our perceptions are crap, by the way. One area of interest for me is just not my camera, effort phenomenology and our perception of effort and how well that.
Let's get into that for sure, but let's make sure we finish up this low back thing.
And it's the same thing, no, we're terrible at kind of actually knowing what's going on in our bodies. We think we're really good at it, but
so you feel
I'm
something.
skeptical.
So you feel something intense going on in your low back. That might be a passive tense contraction of the fascia or the connective tissue, and not an active muscular contraction.
Potentially, yeah.
That's not bad. I kind of like that. So besides this, tell us, can we treat low back pain with the low back extensor strengthening work on the machine, and does that work better than anything else? I know that's a tough question.
First answer is definitely yes. I mean, we've done a few studies now, and we've shown, at least compared to non-training controls, and we've tried a few different sort of iterations of the device, that when you train on the device, we see pretty substantial reductions in pain, reductions in disability, or at least self-report disability. There is some, we've done at least my supervisors had previously done a study comparing restrained and unrestrained. So they trained on the same lumbar extension device, but with or without the restraints that prevent the trunk extension from occurring, and did see better results in the restrained, so the isolated lumbar extension versus the trunk extension condition. But, and this is a big but, like there is a real lack of comparative intervention data looking at lumbar extension strengthening specifically compared to other intervention approaches. I mean, there's one study from Saudi Arabia, or from Abu Dhabi. I can't remember exactly where now. But there's one study that's looked at a few. I'm trying to remember exactly now. I think they may have had an aerobic training component, or a kind of it's from 2005 now, so it's been a while since I looked at it. But needless to say, that there are a few comparative studies looking at this compared to other interventions. But what we do know is from the, at least compared to control conditions, we see fairly large improvements. And one thing that we have seen is I managed to get hold of data from some other authors as well who had done studies using the lumbar extension machine and had measured pain outcomes and disability outcomes and low back pain. And we do see a relationship between, and for these outcomes, it's a moderate correlation, small to moderate correlation, but actually that's fairly big when you consider what we're looking at, between increases in strength and reductions in pain and disability on the lumbar extension device, which is interesting, I think, because when you look at other studies that have looked at things like motor control training or trunk extension training, and then have correlated the changes in performance outcomes from those interventions with pain and disability, they tend to see next to no reductions.
So are you talking about the fact that in these studies where they do say like motor control to help your back pain, people get better, but the people who get better didn't have better motor control? Is that what you're referring to?
Exactly. Yeah. Like it's
that
not
obviously wasn't the key ingredient.
Yeah, which then again makes us think that again, not the ingredient, because there's evidence that more kind of psychosocial outcomes improve as well, just as a result of engaging in this kind of intervention. And I can say from having spent hours putting people through sessions on the machine, people. There is definitely a psychological component to it as well. People come out feeling stronger, they're more confident, and whether that's because they're stronger or whether it's because their pain's improving and which direction all of this goes, is their pain getting better because they're feeling stronger and more confident, or are they feeling stronger and confident because their pain's getting, like, it's difficult to say, but yeah, we do at least think there's something potentially to some specific strengthening of that muscle group that we don't see those results replicated from other kinds of strengthening and exercise interventions.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I've been on those isolated lumbar movement machines, and I get a pretty good psychosocial response from those. I'm kind of a high responder in general. If I go do a deadlift and it feels kind of good, I'll walk around that day feeling stronger. Like I really feel stronger. I can't possibly be stronger because the adaptation,
probably fatigue,
because it's just one set of deadlifts of 100 pounds. But I mean, I'm actually weaker because because I fatigued myself. But I really feel like viscerally stronger, and it affects my self-conception, affects my self-image. I feel more robust. And I like those isolated machines. That kind of makes my back feel a way it doesn't normally feel. I feel muscles firing that don't normally fire. The whole area is kind of pumped up. And I think that stuff's pretty important.
Yeah, and I think that, there's a lot of potential mechanisms that are yet to be explored. One thing which we've been wanting to explore since 2011, which we've applied for funding for about 6 times and not got it, is well, I was originally going to do this as part of my PhD, and we tried to get funding for me to be able to do that, which was to do pre and post MRIs to look at essentially look at a variety of elements of disc condition. To see whether or not there are actually intervertebral disc adaptations occurring as a result of the intervention. Because we had looked into that kind of literature, and one of the interesting things that came out, and again, a lot of this research is on porcine models or rat tail models and things like this, where but there was this sort of trend coming out that the disc doesn't just wear, it is tissue, it adapts. And it seems to be able to adapt in a more sort of anabolic manner to a more kind of high intensity but low frequency and low volume dosing of loading.
So were you thinking that this high intensity exercise provides a general anabolic effect to the area that would extend to the disc and help it repair itself?
This is at least what we were hypothesizing, because the intervention, I should clarify, the intervention that we do in the studies that we've done is essentially once a week a single set to failure of lumbar extension exercise. So like the actual exercise itself is no more than 2 minutes of exercise a week. So I mean we should market that along with the high intensity high intensity interval training stuff. But yeah, like so in our working hypothesis, which we've yet to test or test properly, is that the low frequency, low volume, yet high high magnitude of loading stimulus might induce some adaptive response in the disc.
I like that idea.
I mean, I did a small study during my PhD where, because we couldn't get the funding, we used stadiometry to be able to measure spinal height changes. And the problem is it's not very sensitive. And although we had to kind of build a custom device to be able to measure them, so I got the engineering department to build me some stuff for my research. And we did find like the stadiometry was able to detect the usual kind of creep that you see from sort of quiet sitting. So, you're if you sit, then you keep measuring spinal height, it goes down over time. And so we were like, okay, well, we're able to detect that phenomenon, but we didn't see any changes in spinal height as a result of the intervention that might indicate, greater disc hydration. Which is why at some point, we'd love to be able to get the funding to be able to do the MRI study, because we can get a better look at, well, what's happening across a variety of dimensions in terms of disc health, broadly speaking. So yeah, so we want to do that still at some point. I've just got to keep plugging away and asking for money, and hopefully someone will say yes.
So here, I got a question for you. You're talking about getting the isolated low back extensor work done on this special machine that's not that available to most people. What are some exercises you could do at home or with some common gym equipment to get the isolated lumbar work done? Or do you have to find one of these special machines?
So that's a great question. And it's an area where I'd love to. I've got ideas for research here, but unfortunately, at the moment, kind of not the time or the willing students to help out with them. But I mean, we do really lack good evidence for what other exercises, or it's not clear what other exercises might help strengthen that lumbar musculature. Now, I as much as I've kind of published papers saying like, oh, lumbar extension training compared to any kind of trunk extension movement is optimal. I still think that doing some kind of trunk extension movement is probably better than doing nothing. And I also know that, and I can say, on an individual basis, we see, there are varying responses. So for example, James Fisher did a study while I was doing my undergraduate degree that I participated in, and I can say I was one of the few people in the deadlift group that increased lumbar extension strength as a result of in that intervention arm. So I wonder whether or not there are individual differences because of individual differences in anatomical arrangements that mean that some people are better able to, just purely through their biomechanics, engage the lumbar extensors in trunk extension movements. I also wonder, and this is something I'd love to do, but again, it ends up being a long study, so it's hard to do. I'd like to take people and see whether or not initially doing an isolated lumbar extension intervention to increase their lumbar extension strength means that then when they move on to trunk extension movements, they're better able to utilize that musculature and maintain the strength that they've gained previously on the isolated lumbar extension. But I think in the absence of that, doing some kind of trunk extension is better than nothing. I think doing deadlifts is great, whether it strengthens your lumbar extension strength or not, because just being able to pick up heavy stuff well is a good skill to have. But there have been some studies that have looked at, for example, Roman chair-based trunk extension, and they, at least in terms of take it with a pinch of salt, EMG studies have found that if you try to kind of anteriorly rotate the pelvis and try to focus on a kind of lordotic posture as you kind of extend, then you can, to some extent, you can kind of try to feel like you're better targeting the lumbar extensors in the movement. So a kind of a better sort of like kinesthesia and focus on trying to engage that musculature in those kinds of movements is a good idea. I wouldn't necessarily advise doing that during like heavy deadlifts, but if you're doing more maybe kind of light to moderate sort of load trunk extension movements like a Roman chair, then that's a good idea. Or again, like if you're using a resistance machine for the lower back, most commercially available ones will have some kind of restraint. It might not be optimal, but it will, some restraint is better than no restraint, I think.
Okay, so let's shift gears. Let's talk a little bit about an evolutionary perspective on exercise and back pain. This is something that you've written about. Let's start off with the idea that there's such a thing as a disease of civilization, and we see that with obesity and a lot of metabolic disorders. Modern humans have these all over the place, but hunter-gatherers seem to have almost none of these diseases, which is, to me, has always raised the question, oh my God, do hunter-gatherers have lots of chronic low back pain, or is this a disease of civilization caused by sitting in chairs on Zoom calls and all that kind of stuff? I think there's some books out that say, you can cure all of your ails by living like a hunter-gatherer or paleo person or a caveman. And so you've looked into the question about whether hunter-gatherers have back pain at the same rates as the rest of us. What did you find about that?
Yeah, so I mean, this is fascinating. I'm going to say now, I got told off for going off on this tangent during my PhD because it.
No. Great
stuff. It was. Do you know what? Like, I'll say exactly why I got interested in this, because at that time, like the whole paleo movement was at its kind of zenith, and so it got me thinking about the evolutionary origins of low back pain, because that was my focus at the time. And I went down a rabbit hole and felt very out of my depth reading a lot of the paleoanthropological literature and trying to interpret that with no training in that area whatsoever. But I spent a couple of years thinking about it, reading about it, and put a paper together that peer reviewers with more expertise in this area than I liked. So I was happy with that. But yeah, so I spent a bit of time looking. I was interested as well because I'd seen stuff being shared by Esther Gokhale, who often spoke about the exemplary postures of these romanticized versions of hunter-gatherers that the kind of paleo community love. And so I was interested to go and see, well, what data do we have on hunter-gatherer populations with respect to low back pain? And the real answer is we don't really have any on like true hunter-gatherer populations anymore, but we do at least have some on sort of more pastoral herding populations. And there is some data on Australian Aborigines, although you have to take into account that they are somewhat more modernized than they were. But I mean, when you look across the data that we do have, I mean, it really doesn't. There's no convincing evidence that they have any less back pain that we do.
How good is the data? I mean, I know you've got. I looked over some of the data in your papers, and so you find the rural Thai in another group seems like they've got super low back pain. In other groups, they've got really high, but it's not really clear. You go ask people that are from a different culture speaking a different language, hey, how's your back feel? It feels just fine. What does that really mean? There might be a problem with the translation. So how good's the data on all this stuff?
Well, so it's not great, and I mean there is some evidence that, particularly in Australian Aborigines, that they don't want to tell the white man that their back hurts because that signifies weakness, and so
maybe even to their neighbors it signifies weakness. Maybe there's a cultural norm against showing any kind of weakness. Who knows?
Exactly. And so so reporting is difficult here, but the fact that at least some of these cultures that we think of as being more sort of like traditional and less westernized, in some cases have rates that are almost as high as what we see in Western sort of populations, makes me think that it's probably an issue of reporting and probably an issue of underreporting more so than overreporting. It at least seems less plausible to me that people are going to willingly kind of tell people like, oh yeah, my back's really bad from these traditional populations. So I feel like in those studies where we've got incredibly low prevalence rates, they are probably underestimating, and more likely than those where we see high rates in these populations are overestimating. So I mean, you know, I've been skeptical for a while of the kind of romantic picture of
Yeah.
you know, hunter gatherers as being these perfectly healthy kind of
Yeah,
individuals in that respect.
appropriately so. But I mean, the evidence is quite striking in regard to heart disease and obesity and metabolic issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's pretty solid. You've got other evidence against the idea that the natural state of a human is not to have back pain, in the form of comparing human spines to those of chimps and other primates.
Yeah, so I mean the kind of, I mean, and this goes really back to how the spine has evolved to permit the different forms of gait that we see across different populations, different primate species, and you know, essentially we've kind of been left with the kind of compromise of a spine that is long and flexible to permit our kind of bipedal gait. Whereas previously, kind of our and again, this comes from looking at both the paleoanthropological literature and comparisons anatomically with great ape species, which obviously aren't our ancestors, but some of our ancestors had similar, or it's at least, you know, hypothesized that they had similar kind of lumbar pelvic anatomy. They had these kind of much shorter spinal columns. They had much higher kind of pelvis and iliac crest.
That creates low back stability, right?
And entrapment. Yeah, it's basically just like a nice block to permit the sort of gait that they're involved in, which is this kind of bent hip, bent knee gait that kind of, they basically just kind of, when they're bipedal walking, waddle. Prior to that, you know, what is emblematic of old world monkeys is this long, flexible lumbar spine, because a lot of their movements involve large excursions of flexion and extension, because they're leaping and you know, I mean, if you watch like kind of you know, gibbons and running around and lemurs and things like that,
they boing around.
Yeah, there's a lot of spinal flexion extension occurring there. And so yeah, so we've kind of ended up with this compromise of you know, a long flexible lumbar spine with not a lot of kind of passive stability from our pelvis.
What's the length for? Does that help the transverse movements and the walking? Is that what that's for?
Yeah, exactly. So if you can kind of look at Grakovetsky's spinal engine model, you know, his assertion is essentially, you know, it's enabled us to permit that kind of transverse movement that occurs during bipedal gait. But yeah, you know, and the funny thing is, you know, people often think that you know, if we had evolved to be more susceptible to back pain, we would have died out years ago. But that's just not how evolution works. That, you know, every adaptation we have has you know, positives and negatives to survival. Well, you know, to fitness, which in evolutionary sense is do you survive long enough to procreate and pass on your information? And so, you know, we can have traits that are termed as costly, because although on balance, the benefits that they provide outweigh the negatives.
So you stand up, you get your hands free, huge benefits. It's okay if that you get some occasional back pain as far as natural selection is concerned, as long as you can, you know, throw the spear at the woolly mammoth.
Exactly. Or see across the savannah, or, you know, you know, the ability to better thermoregulate in those environments. You know, there's a lot of kind of hypotheses for why being upright confers a considerable survival advantage. And so if having a few niggles in your lower back is the cost of that, then yeah. And again, maybe I wonder sometimes whether the issues we see from low back pain in kind of more modern times are a result of the fact that we're all pretty susceptible to low back pain in the first place, just because by dint of being humans, but that socio-cultural kind of environment, going back to this idea of that people are more likely to sort of experience disability as a result of it, because it's maybe a bit more accepted, or to talk about it, or to to not do things because your back hurts. If your back hurt and you were being chased down by a by a saber-toothed tiger, you'd still damn run.
Yeah. Very, very, very fascinating questions. So also on hunter-gatherers, you've done some look into how much they exercise, how much they move, what kinds of physical stress they're doing. There's this idea that you should move like a caveman or exercise like a caveman or have a Paleolithic prescription to figure out how to exercise. I like these ideas, but there's some romantic fallacies and naturalistic fallacies there. And figuring out exactly how much our ancestors were moving is interesting to me. And one way to do that is to look at how much hunter-gatherers move today. How many miles do they walk in a day? What kinds of physical tasks do they do? This is another area where you've done some research. What's your general conclusion there, or what do you find?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting actually. I mean, it varies obviously across the populations that you look at, the specific hunter-gatherer populations that you look at in terms of how active they are. It's very environmentally determined, but they're far less active than we often think they are. And again, I
Is
gave
sitting killing them?
Sitting's probably not killing them. But yeah, I mean, and again, actually, if you look across other primate species as well, like when they can be lazy, they're really lazy. There's no wasted energy there.
We're a little bit late. We're a little bit less lazy than chimps and gorillas and bonobos. Is that right?
Maybe a little bit, but I mean, the differences we see aren't anywhere near as drastic as I think that they're normally portrayed, at least by that, the kind of paleo evolutionary fitness sort of community.
Have you read the new book by Daniel Lieberman called Exercised?
I haven't yet. No, I read Story of the Human Body when that came out, but I haven't read his new book yet. And I know Herman Ponce's got a book that's just come out as well, which
I'm definitely going to get that one. That one's called Burn, and it's coming out in March. Yeah. Now, that reminds me, Poncer, it was either Poncer or Raiklen. These are guys that study the Hadza along with Lieberman. He said in an article in NPR, these guys don't have back pain.
That's interesting.
I would think he would know. I mean, he might not have the formal data, but he's hanging out with these guys. He's talking to them all the time. I'd like to get a little bit more information on that.
Yeah,
but there's certainly no data there.
Yeah, again, it would be interesting to know, are they just telling him they don't have back pain? Because again, I mean, this is a real. I share a faculty at the university with sociologists who do ethnographic work, and you have to be quite careful. It's a sort of Schrodinger's cat kind of issue. The observer has an impact on the well, it's not quite the analogy, but to what extent has him doing research on them and elevating their
there's a transaction going on there. They're playing the people that are coming to study them. There's a whole business about going to study the Hadza, right? And
but yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, and again, I think what else is interesting was when you start to nail down what their activity patterns actually look like, because actually, I mean, they are more active than modern populations are.
I heard a talk that you did where you had an estimate of how much they walked in a day, how many steps they did in a day, which is a lot lower than the one that I came up with doing my own research, and also that I think Lieberman did. You had these guys not really walking around that much.
Yeah, so I mean, it's been a while since I did that.
I had it at like 6 to 9 miles a day as an average, but you had it estimated lower than that.
Yeah, I think it was when we were looking at the physical activity levels across hunter-gatherer populations, agricultural populations, modern populations, and the Paleolithic standard. And the interesting thing was that when you statistically analyze across those studies, there's not like any real significant difference. There's a slight trend towards greater activity levels in the hunter-gatherers and the agricultural populations when you purely look at physical activity levels. But yeah, some of the studies that we looked at, I'm trying to remember now, were what it did was look at studies that had looked at foraging ranges, and tried to sort of determine from them like how much, over what sort of range people are moving, why they're making these movements and things like that. And a lot of children are a lot more active than adults, and also, so some of the data from the persistence hunting studies as well typically show that even when they are moving a lot or moving far, they're moving at a very low speed. Like these persistence hunts, we see the videos and stuff, and all we see are the clips of them jogging and this, that, and the other. Most of the time they're walking, at least from the data. Like,
it's a fast walk, a little bit of a jog.
Yeah.
It's a long time. It's a long time though. I mean, it might go like 10 to 15 miles.
Yeah, but also they're not doing that every day.
No,
doing that like once a week, maybe once a fortnight. They're doing it when it needs to be done. It was interesting. There was a great was it the Yamaguchi? I can't remember now. God, because it's been about 6 years since I gave that talk. I can't remember what tribe it was now, but there was a great there's a great paper of a South American tribe, I think in Bolivia. Maybe I'm gonna completely mind blank on it now. But I can remember there's a fantastic graph that looked at that visualized their activity patterns across different hours of the day, both night and day. And most of it is very low. Most of it's sedentary. Most of it's very low level activity. They're chill out when they need to chill out, and they'll move when they need to move. What was really interesting is when you look at the night, there's a thin sliver of very intense activity that occurs in the middle of the night.
Now there's the
I would love to speculate on what that is.
That's living like a caveman.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, so I think it's been over romanticized how much more active they are than us. I think they are more active than us, but not, hugely more active. I think what's more interesting though is when you look at the patterns of activity, it's typically when they are active, it's more low intensity, longer kind of slower duration, slower activity, and bursts of high intensity of effort work.
Well, this is something I noticed from one of your talks. There, you're saying, you know what, we're not really doing that bad compared to hunter-gatherers in terms of the low-level activity, but they have more intensity in their day. Where does that come from? If you're hunter-gatherers, what do they do that's intense?
Well, I think it's, again, if they're hunting, it's typically the hunting. It's the, in the persistence hunt, it's the final sprints, the short sprints and things like that, or the occasional lifting of heavy things, when you're foraging, having to carry the big basket of berries back, or
but that's going for miles. I mean, it's kind of intense for a long time, but it's not like one of your hit sessions where it's like a minute set.
Yeah, no, I mean, and this is the thing, but I guess we can also then get into the debate of like, I mean, for them, practically it needs to be that far because that's how far they've got to walk. But, would they get the same physiological benefits in terms of fitness, health, and well-being if they had to walk a tenth of that distance? Probably, from what we know from modern exercise physiology in terms of what dose induces degree of adaptation. So I think there's also a caution that needs to be had in terms of going like, well, we should just emulate what they're doing. I mean, they do what they're doing because that's their way of life. That's what they need to do to live. For us, because it's not part of our life, what our kind of goal, I think, should be is to engineer. Well, think first, what do we want out of this? If it's health, fitness, and well-being, and etc., then we need to think to ourselves, well, okay, what does modern exercise physiology, coupled with some understanding of our evolutionary kind of history, end up providing us in terms of a prescription to maximize those outcomes? That doesn't interfere with the way we currently live.
Okay, so this is a transition in the other topic I want to talk about. If you have time, you have time for one more?
Sure.
Talk about high intensity stuff in general. So we know there's a lot of research that says you can get a lot of the benefits from exercise in a very, very short amount of time if you do something that's very, very intense. Fitness benefits, health benefits, lots of studies on Tabata protocol, stuff like that. The style of training that you have been a part of, from Arthur Jones, the HIT style, is really compress that intensity down into the smallest little pill and say, this is the essential active ingredient in all exercise, and we're going to give you this pill, but it doesn't taste that good. It's hard to swallow, isn't it? Because the kind of intensity that you see. So I watch videos of people doing HIT style exercise. I've watched some of you too online doing, like, let's say you do a set of, you do one set for one muscle group, and it's how long, like a minute and a half or something, and it's intense. You go to failure, and most people never go to failure. And if you watch someone going to failure, it's horrible. They're breathing really hard. It looks like the opposite of an orgasm. It looks like you're dying. And so, I mean, I've tried to do this myself, to do like proper high intensity going to failure type stuff. And you say, well, this is only going to last a minute or two, and I'm just going to tough it out and then be done for the week, because that's all I have to do for the week. But it's that last 10 or 15 seconds is incredibly difficult. And I think there's only certain kinds of people that can find the motivation to do it. But I know you've studied motivation to exercise and the perception of effort. Let's talk a little bit about that in relation to the kind of exercise that you do and recommend.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, and actually this ties in nicely, because we've recently just pre-printed a, well, as far as we're aware, it is the biggest and longest study of resistance training that's ever been done. And it is a retrospective study, but we have data from, we've partnered with an organization called Fit20, who essentially have a franchise model where their studios deliver once a week supervised high intensity resistance training. It's approximately 6 exercises, single set to failure, bish bash bosh, done. But they record all of their data from all of their clients, and it goes straight up to a cloud database, and they graciously gave us access to that. So we had nearly 15,000 people worth of data over almost 7 years, and we're able to model strength adaptation over that time from just doing once a week training. And yeah, to kind of highlight the benefits of it, and this is interesting as well, just in terms of strength development. After about a year, we saw rapid gains in strength, sort of 30 to 50% gains in strength over the first year of training, that then start to plateau out, and essentially just pretty much plateau out after that point.
That was after a year it plateaus.
After about a year, we see that kind of plateau starting to kick in. Now, of course, we don't have a comparator group or anything like that. We don't know whether maybe changing the stimulus, increasing the volume, variety, all of the things that people say need to be done to break plateaus and whatnot would make a difference to that. We suspect probably not. We think that a plateau in performance, given that amount of time, is pretty much just a physiological kind of certainty. Mileage will vary on an individual basis, but one thing we did do is we took data from the Open Powerlifting database, and we took a random sample of 10,000 powerlifters and did the same thing. We modeled their performance over time, and they show a tiny little increase in strength up to about a year, and then they also plateau in terms of performance after that period of time. So, and that's despite the fact that powerlifters typically train, almost exclusively with higher volumes, periodized programs, and all this kind of stuff. So, the interesting thing is, at least from a public health perspective, minimal effective dose training in that form can pretty much get you where you're going to go.
Tons of bang for your buck.
Absolutely,
with the very high intensity stuff. But the kicker is it harder to motivate people to do that very high intensity stuff?
Yeah, so this, I think this comes onto the question as well of obviously the recommendation with a lot of this training is to train to failure. Now, if you actually look at the data on this, and Brad Schoenfeld's recently published a meta-analysis on this, there's not really a lot of difference in terms of training to failure or not training to failure. Now, an issue with that research is that it typically looks at that question in a dichotomous fashion. So it's to failure or not to failure. And most of the studies that have examine this, typically the not to failure condition is still pretty damn close to failure.
Yeah, the question is, how close can you get? Should you have 0 reps in the tank, 1 reps in the tank, 2, 3?
Exactly. And so, we've done work as well looking at how good people are at predicting how close to failure they are. And I'm also in the process of doing a meta-analysis with Israel Halperin, where we've pooled every study that's looked at this, and people aren't very good at predicting how close to failure they are. They
Oh, they're
tend to
not. They're not. I thought that RPE was generally people are pretty good at knowing how hard they're working.
people tend to so when you look at predicting proximity to failure, I mean, so we assume that people's predictions are based on how hard it feels. It's probably a mixture of how hard it feels, how uncomfortable it feels, do I want to stop now, and things like that in reality. So people tend to overestimate how close to failure they are. By around about the meta-analysis that we've done says that people tend to be about 1 rep off. So, so for example, if people, it's not a huge difference, but it may be enough of a difference to make a have an impact on adaptation. But this is where I think practically it's the case of, I typically tell people now, look, aim for failure, because if you get there, you've crossed whatever threshold there is. We also know from the evidence that if you train to failure, as much as people in the sort of strength and conditioning community often talk about the potential for overtraining and things like that, there's next to no evidence that is the case, except for one poorly conducted indirect study with some
and
elevated
especially not with the style of, but I mean, with the style of training that you recommend is preventing over failure is kind of baked into the basic recipe, because you're only doing 1 set and you're only doing it once or twice a week anyway.
Exactly, yeah. And so what I tend to tell people is, if you aim for failure and try and get as close as you can get, you've probably got as close as you need to. And so it's a good goal. If you can get there, then you've at least crossed that threshold. But it does seem as though the probably the most important component, but not the only component, and one which can be influenced by manipulating other aspects of training, is probably the intensity of effort that people put into the training. But yeah, like I'm in the process of doing more kind of psychophysics work on trying to really understand, how good is our perception of effort as a representation of the actual effort involved in task performance, particularly things like exercise. And people, it seems as though our perception of effort is I call it a coarse-grained representation. It's like, we're pretty good at telling if something's harder. We're pretty good at telling if something's easier. So kind of like directionally, we're pretty good at knowing when things are getting harder and knowing when things are getting easier. But the accuracy of it in terms of saying, like, if this actually requires like 70% of your capacity, 70% effort, it might feel to you like it's like 75 or 80%. And there's a lot of noise, but coarsely, it's not a bad representation of it. But then on that individual kind of case by case basis, it's worth knowing that, like, okay, like I might feel like I'm only going to get 1 or 2 more reps out of this, but I should just keep going just to double check. Like,
I think when you're doing the HIIT style exercise, knowing that you have much less margin for error than like a more conventional exercise thing where you're going 5 days a week and 3 sets of 10 like that. If I show up, I'm used to going to the gym like 5 days a week and doing 3 sets of 10 type stuff. And if I work moderately hard every day, I'll get the job done. But if I'm doing the style of exercise where it's only going to last for a minute or two, all of the benefit is in that last 20 seconds. And if you miss that, you're getting nothing. And it's very hard to get yourself into that. It's very hard to get yourself to that last 20 seconds.
So there's an interesting discussion here, actually, where I was involved in the revision of the UK Chief Medical Officer's physical activity guidelines, which are basically like, I guess, what the sort of CDC guidelines are. I think it's the CDC that put it out in the US. But the physical activity guidelines for Americans, this is UK's version, essentially. And I was involved in revising and reviewing the evidence for the 2019 guidelines. And it was interesting, actually, because we got into a bit of a debate, because the guidance we were given was that we were providing guidelines based on what the evidence for efficacy is with regard to the optimal dose, and that the guidelines were to say, like, look, this is what you should do, and then it's up to other people to kind of like figure out ways of getting people to follow those behaviors. And so I was lumped with reviewing the resistance training research, and when we looked at the data, it was like, well, actually, once a week gets you pretty much what you're going to get. But the current guidelines were to engage in that type of activity twice a week. And there was an interesting discussion that emerged across the committee, which was to say, like, look, there are we need to potentially consider the impact that changing guidelines might have on public perception and things like that. So we ended up going with twice a week still, but acknowledged in our report, like, there is some evidence that actually this could be as low as once a week, and that's absolutely fine. But the argument put forth around it was, look, twice a week isn't worse than once a week. Like, it's not like doing it twice a week is going to cause any problems. But if you tell people once a week and they miss a session, then they've missed it for a whole week. If you tell people do twice a week and they miss one, then they've probably still got what they need to get out of it. So I tend to, as much as, for example, so that, like, the Fit 20 study I mentioned is a unique kind of population, and these are clients who have, for them, they've decided this is what they want to do. This is the service they want. They want to go train once a week. I personally train 2 or 3 times a week, and I tend to say to people, like, look, unless you're really committed and able to stick to that kind of like once a week protocol, then train a little bit more frequently, give yourself a little bit more kind of like leeway to miss sessions here and there if you need to. But don't sweat it so much, I think, as well. I've become way more laid back about exercise prescription.
So I think that I've read something from you, and HIT people in general can give pretty short, sweet, evidence-based recommendations for doing resistance training. So, like, how many times a week, how many exercises, how many sets, give us kind of like a really short, sweet recipe that would work for a lot of people, provided they could find that they can do the high intensity stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I think a perfect kind of minimal effective dose approach is, once a week, but I'm going to say twice a week because of exactly what I just said. But twice a week, an upper body push, an upper body pull, and some sort of lower body compound movement. And a single set of those to failure twice a week is going to get you pretty much everything you're going to get, at least for the general population in terms of health, fitness, etc. That's pretty much it. And the vast majority of people could do that with some form of a press up, some form of a row based exercise at home from a table, or from using a towel or something like that, hung over the door, and then body weight squats or a wall sit. Now the lower body stuff is when you're strong, that can be uncomfortable because the time under load becomes quite long.
It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. I don't think that I'm capable of going to failure in a squat type movement. I can do it with like pull-ups or push-ups. I mean, I literally just fail, but I will not fail in a wall sit. I will quit.
So one of the things I do suggest for people on a wall sit is to basically use a kind of like isometric co-contraction with it as well, and think to yourself, like, contract your quads, contract your glutes, contract your hamstrings, and basically just tense as hard as you can.
Okay, so that'll make it quicker.
Yeah, I want to try and fail as quickly as possible, because that will reduce the amount of the length of time I have to experience the discomfort. Because I think as well, that exercise in particular, because it's an isometric movement as well, you get more peripheral occlusion, you get more kind of group 3-4 fiber afferent fibers firing. You get a lot more discomfort as a result of it. And then because the actual force requirements are very low to do that movement, it lasts a lot longer, so you end up experiencing that discomfort over a longer period of time. And I mean, I personally love it, but as I said at the beginning, I'm a masochist, and so
so I've had you for a while now. I don't want to keep you too long. What are you working on now? What's the kind of a question you have? New research, new direction?
So I'm constantly working on a bunch of stuff at the moment. I mean, I've got a lot of great PhD students working on a variety of topics. I mean, one of the things I love so much about my job at the moment is I've taken a real interest more in sort of methodology and statistics, and so I find myself being involved in a lot of projects, more in that kind of general philosophical, methodological, and statistical kind of role. but in terms of specific stuff that I'm really interested in enjoying at the moment, um, I and my colleague James Fisher led a study last year where we were looking at what impact lockdown had on people's resistance training behaviors. And so we did quite a big international survey study of that, and so that was very interesting to look at how people adapted to being able to continue resistance training with the absence of gyms, what was impacting their sort of perspectives on that training and so on. So that was interesting. But the real thing that's kind of, it's been my kind of puzzle I've been trying to work on for a number of years now. I've always been fascinated by this idea of effort and what is effort, and I think it stemmed from initially resistance training and the idea of training to failure. And I published many years ago on this idea of like, I hate the phrase intensity. Like, it gets misused, it's confusing, it's if I use it, I try to qualify it as intensity of something, as in the magnitude of effort or the magnitude of load or whatever. But this idea of like, what actually is the effort involved in doing a task, whether physical, cognitive, whatever, and then what is the kind of what is it that gives rise to that kind of phenomenological experience of trying to do something, and that's been utterly fascinating. And I ended up down a huge rabbit hole with that, because it started with interest because of resistance training and exercise more broadly, and the more I read the literature in our fields on that topic, the more and more disappointed I was with the lack of precision in terms of definition of terms, and lack of kind of consideration for a more kind of philosophical, conceptual analysis of like, what actually is this thing we're trying to understand. We have to think what it is we're trying to understand before we can then even take any steps towards figuring out how do you measure the damn thing, and how do you actually try to observe it and manipulate it and see what effects it's happening on things.
Well,
And
the
so
the closer you look, the fuzzier it gets, right?
yeah, well, at the very I was fortunate last year in a weird way. I was put on furlough at the beginning of lockdown, and it actually opened up a little bit of time for me to spend working on this topic. And I'd had a paper in me for probably the better part of 3 years that needed writing, and it was a really enjoyable experience to sit down and put that paper together. And I published it subsequently as a preprint, where I've tried to kind of outline all of this, this huge amount of research that I've read over the last decade, and try to come up with a good operational definition, conceptually and construct wise, for the actual effort involved in doing a task, and then try to which I think I've got a pretty good robust
Can
definition.
you tell us can you tell us quickly what your definition of effort is, or do we need a PhD to
No, it's really simple. Like, it's so simple that I feel like it's stupid, like that no one else has put it down. Well, actually, that's not true. Like, some people have conceptualized it in this way, but they've just not been particularly clear in how they've sort of explained it, and it's normally been in quite obscure sort of journals. So essentially, it's as simple as saying it's the ratio of the demands of the task that you're performing to the current capacity to meet those demands. And this is where, like, resistance training is a wonderful example for it, because you can always use the example of saying, well, if you can lift 100 kilos and I give you 50 kilos, well, then that takes 50% effort to do it. And you can conceptually think of it at any given point. If I tell you to continue doing reps of that 50 kilos, well, every rep you're doing is causing fatigue. What is fatigue? It's a drop in your capacity to meet those demands. So the 50 kilos remains the same. You started with 100. Every time you do a rep, it comes down, and so that 50 kilos is becoming relatively higher and higher, and so it requires relatively more and more effort to do. And so just conceptualizing it in this way has opened up some interesting possibilities to better explore then the psychophysics of, well, if we're saying actual effort is this operationalized definition, then we can start to look at tasks and say, well, what is the actual effort at a given time point in this task? And then what are people's perceptions of the effort at that time point? And we can start to map how well they kind of agree with one another. How good are our perceptions at being a representation of the reality in terms of the actual effort required? And so I'm actually at the moment, because we're still in lockdown in the UK. My wife is is ambivalent about this, but I'm actually doing some small sample but high trial number experiments at home with me and my wife at the moment, looking at exploring some of these psychophysical relationships using a variety of different kind of task experimental models. We've got a fatiguing model using an isometric hand grip dynamometer, which we can use, which I've got one which records forces in real time. And that's nice because essentially we've got a protocol where you set, say, 10% of your initial MVC. So you do an MVC, this is how strong you are. Okay, we're going to set 10% of that. You're going to then squeeze and maintain 10% for 30 seconds. Every 10 seconds, we give from a 0 to 100%. How much effort does it feel like? And then you do another quick brief MVC, and then you do the 10% for, and then the force requirements are always 10% of your baseline. So the force requirements remain the same, but every 30 seconds, we're doing another MVC. So what we're able to do is take each of those MVCs all the way up until the point of task failure and fit a regression to them to say, well, between each of those MVCs, what were we predicting your MVC was at any given point? And so we can calculate at any different time point what
is it accurate? Can you accurately predict?
I mean, it seems to be pretty good. Like the decay and fatigue is pretty consistently just linear across time. So it's quite nice. And the nice thing is actually, and not to get too sort of like statistically heavy in it, normally you've got worry about overfitting with statistical models. If you put too much stuff in it, you make the model too complex, it will fit the data perfectly, but it won't explain anything to you. But for this, we almost aren't worried about overfitting because we're not interested in explaining fatigue. So even if the fatigue was a weird, complicated kind of, polynomial to the nth degree, we could fit the model to it and say, well, we're just interested in the relationship between whatever the best fitting model prediction is and the current task demands. And then we can start to plot those together. We're doing another one as well, which is a simple matching task. So it's a case of saying, well, like Todd, I'm going to give you this hand grip dyno, and I want you to squeeze it with 10%. And now I want you to squeeze it with 70%, and now 80%. And then what we do is we take the forces you produced and express them relative to your MVC to see, well, how much effort did you actually put into it versus how much effort you thought it was because I told you to squeeze at what you thought was 80% or whatever.
That'd be interesting. I predict that people are going to be pretty accurate in with their perceptions of effort within moderate ranges of effort that they normally make. With the high intensity, that's not an area that I go into that often. When I do, I'll bet I'm not that accurate.
Well, so see, I think there's an inherent scaling ceiling and floor on this anyway, because people are actually pretty good at knowing, like, people are good when they know they're trying as hard as they can. Or they're fairly good at it, because there's a ceiling effect somewhat to it. Assuming people are not conflating their perception of effort with how uncomfortable it feels and other salient kind of aspects of that phenomenological experience. And also people are very good at knowing when they're not doing anything. So 0 and 100 are good anchors. What's interesting is what happens in the middle. And at the very least, the data that I shared it on my Twitter, actually, some of the trials that I've started modeling some of the data just to take a look at it. And on aggregate, I suspect on aggregate that actually the perception is actually pretty good. Over sufficient trials, sufficient experiments, people are generally probably on average not bad at perceiving the effort required. Bear in mind, this is me who thinks about this a lot and is very experienced, and my wife is definitely not. Like, we're chalk and cheese in terms of that perspective. Like, she hates sport and exercise, and and I love it. So we're almost a good contrast, but she's almost as damn good as I am, like at getting this stuff.
Interesting, yeah.
But like trial to trial, there's a huge amount of variation. I think as well, there might be some interesting components that we see in the fatiguing trial where we're starting to see that the perception tends to grow quicker than the actual does, because it's interesting. If you have a kind of, even if you have a linear decay in terms of like your MVC going down and fixed force demands, what you end up with is an effort that looks like that rather than like that. Just because of the nature of how that ratio changes between the two values. So actual effort kind of increases like that, but then people's perception, or at least our perception of effort, seems to go like that. So it kind of goes quicker and then sort of like starts to meet where it is at 100%. But again, we've not done a huge number of trials because I'm basically getting away with what I can with my wife at the moment.
Well, best of luck with that. Hey, where can we find you on social media or the internet, or you're on Twitter, right?
Yeah, so Twitter is where I'm most active, and it's at James Steele II. There's a story behind that. It's supposed to be James Steele II, because my dad's also James Steele. And yeah, like I tend to share pretty much any of the work that we do on there. Also random anime videos and clips and various things as well. So you know, it's a pretty laid back account, and I tend to moan about a lot of open science and bad science stuff as well. And then ResearchGate is a good place to keep up to date with you know, any new research that we've published, or new preprints, or anything like that.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. I really enjoyed it.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Todd.